Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the ACAD Readers Briefing, the podcast that turns a full issue of a major magazine into a focused 30 to 60-minute audio briefing. Today, we are bringing you a reader's guide to the July and August 2026 issue of Foreign Affairs. The cover asks a direct and urgent question: who will win the next war? It shows an uncrewed combat platform surrounded by explosions and long-range fire. The image captures the central concern running through this issue. Low-cost uncrewed systems, artificial intelligence, nuclear deterrence, industrial capacity, and alliance strength are all redefining what military advantage now means. This issue revolves around 5 major questions. First, will artificial intelligence deliver a new productivity revival, or will it push white-collar employment, professional training, and income protection to the front line of politics? Second, when cheap drones and conventional weapons can strike nuclear powers and nuclear facilities, can nuclear deterrence still provide meaningful security? Third, can the United States preserve its military advantage in an era of drone swarms, rapidly spreading artificial intelligence, and increasingly unfavorable cost exchanges? Fourth, why did the tactical success of the United States and Israel against Iran fail to produce a safer, more stable, and more prosperous Middle East? And fifth, in the contest between the Heartland and the Rimland, who will be more successful in organizing economic, technological, industrial, and alliance power? Taken together, the articles in this issue show how the spread of new technologies is reshaping economic growth, conventional warfare, nuclear security, and competition among alliances. Military and economic advantage no longer depend only on the performance of a single weapon, platform, or technology. They depend on whether production capacity, organizational speed, defensive costs, political coordination, and international cooperation can move together. The United States and its partners still possess formidable economic, technological, and military resources. But those resources do not automatically produce lasting security. To turn strength into durable advantage, they must build institutions, replenish inventories, expand industrial capacity, accelerate decision-making, and sustain shared commitments among allies. The United States and its partners still possess formidable economic, technological, and military resources. But those resources do not automatically produce lasting security. To turn strength into durable advantage, they must build institutions, replenish inventories, expand industrial capacity, accelerate decision-making, and sustain shared commitments among allies. Without that foundation, tactical victories and temporary technological leads may remain exactly that, temporary. Next, we turn to the individual article briefings from this issue.
Section 1. Systemic, Technological, and Strategic Shocks. This section examines how technological diffusion is reshaping economic growth, conventional warfare, nuclear security, and alliance competition. The true determinant of advantage is no longer solely a single capability, but rather the ability to synchronize production capacity, organizational speed, defense costs, and transnational collaboration. 1.1. How to survive the AI shock. The article argues that artificial intelligence offers enormous promise for the world economy and the United States, but it may also concentrate harm with extraordinary speed among young, highly educated white-collar workers. United States non-farm business productivity grew by 3% in 2024, And McKinsey estimated that by 2030, artificial intelligence agents and robots could create between $2.9 trillion and $6.4 trillion in new annual value for the United States. At the same time, employment fell by 6% among workers aged 22 to 25 in the occupations most exposed to artificial intelligence, with software development and customer service as leading examples. Automating tasks does not mean that an entire occupation disappears, but if models take over research, first drafts, data checking, and routine customer work, young workers may lose the entry-level tasks through which they acquire judgment and experience. The article proposes 3 policies. It calls for tax credits for new skills training, wage loss insurance for displaced workers who accept lower-paid jobs, and a 25% payroll tax on equity compensation that could raise at least $100 billion a year for training and income support. The long-term gains from artificial intelligence may be immense, but broad economic gains do not automatically compensate concentrated losses. A portion of the gains must be committed to adjustment before political resistance hardens into a defining crisis. 1.2. The strange defeat of nuclear deterrence. The article begins with Operation Spiderweb in June 2025. Ukraine concealed short-range attack drones in cargo trucks and launched them through Russia's mobile phone network, destroying at least 10 strategic bombers and damaging 41 aircraft. Moscow had said that a conventional attack on strategic assets could provoke a nuclear response. Yet that doctrine did not stop Kyiv, and Russia did not use nuclear weapons. Ukraine has continued to strike deep inside Russia. Iran and its proxies have repeatedly attacked nuclear-armed Israel, and India and Pakistan entered their most serious conventional conflict in decades in 2025. Nuclear weapons still help prevent direct war between nuclear peers, but they do not automatically deter cheap drones, missiles, proxy operations, or limited conventional attacks. The article therefore shifts the emphasis from retaliation to deterrence by denial. Nuclear states should spend more on cheap and plentiful air defense, missile defense, electronic warfare, cyber protection, dispersed deployment, and resilience around nuclear facilities. Governments should also strengthen norms against conventional attacks on nuclear power plants and military nuclear sites. And they should distinguish clearly between nuclear and conventional attack in their declaratory policies. More nuclear weapons in more countries will not prevent conventional war. It will create more opportunities for unauthorized use, accidents, miscalculation, and nuclear terrorism, especially as artificial intelligence compresses decision time. The strategic adjustment is to restore nuclear weapons to a limited role, deterring nuclear attack rather than pretending to provide an all-purpose shield.
1.3. Losing the War of the Future. The article argues that the United States conducted more than 13,000 strikes against Iran and still failed to prevent more than 2,200 missiles and 4,400 drones from being launched across the region. At least 8 United States aircraft were destroyed or damaged, several radars were hit, 7 service members were killed, the Iranian regime survived, and the Strait of Hormuz remained under pressure. For decades, the United States relied on advantages in stealth, precision-guided weapons, and global positioning systems. The technologies now transforming war, drones and artificial intelligence, are spreading globally. Ukraine produces 4 million drones a year, while the United States Army is acquiring only 50,000, and the American defense system remains poor at building cheaply, responding quickly, and scaling production. Tomorrow's drones will operate as intelligent swarms that search for mobile targets, overwhelm defenses, and form communications and logistics networks resilient to disruption. Armed forces will need more decentralized command and new organizational structures. Computing power will matter as manufacturing capacity mattered in the industrial age. Export controls on advanced chips and semiconductor equipment remain useful, but models will spread, and the decisive question will be which military changes its doctrine, training, procurement, and organization first. The Pentagon must also rebuild trust with technology companies, establish guardrails, standards, and testing, and measure sensors, data, computing power, and changes in actual workflows rather than count only ships, aircraft, and personnel. The Pentagon must also rebuild trust with technology companies, establish guardrails, standards, and testing, and measure sensors, data, computing power, and changes in actual workflows rather than count only ships, aircraft, and personnel. The United States does not lack individual technologies. Its budget system, service cultures, and procurement process still manage the required capabilities separately. Without immediate reform, more determined competitors will overtake it. 1.4. The Middle East Power Paradox. The article argues that the United States and Israel displayed overwhelming conventional power against Iran. Before the April 8th ceasefire, the United States flew more than 10,000 sorties, struck more than 130,000 targets, and intercepted 1,700 Iranian missiles and drones. Yet the Iranian regime did not surrender, its regional influence was not eliminated, and no stronger nuclear agreement emerged. Tehran adopted an attrition strategy, struck civilian infrastructure, drained interceptor inventories, and used small boats, drones, mines, and coastal firing units to create persistent uncertainty in the Strait of Hormuz. The war demonstrated unprecedented United States and Israeli military coordination and the value of a multinational warning and air defense network. It also exposed an unsustainable material burden. The United States fired more than 1,000 Tomahawk cruise missiles in a few weeks, but can produce only 90 to 100 a year. It also expended at least 190 terminal high-altitude area defense interceptors and 1,060 Patriot interceptors. Washington needs dispersed bases, rotational deployments, cheaper defenses, faster military sales and technology transfer, and joint development and production with Gulf partners, Ukraine, and Israel. Gulf states are already diversifying their defense relationships. The United States can no longer act only as the region's sole security guarantor. It must become a security integrator that connects different radars, interceptors, communication systems, and defense industries. The real test is not whether Washington can destroy targets again, but whether it can sustain a regional order under conditions of depleted ammunition, vulnerable bases, and domestic resistance to prolonged war. Otherwise, a display of unmatched military power may inaugurate a post-American Middle East. 1.5. Heartland versus Rimland. The article describes a renewed contest between a Eurasian heartland and a maritime rimland. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea support one another through trade, finance, technology, transport corridors, dual-use goods, missiles, and drones. They can generate acute crises through cyber attacks, digital disinformation, precision weapons, and nuclear brinkmanship. But they still lack the economic and technological strength required to defeat a United States-led coalition in a generational contest. North America, the Euro area, and the leading Indo-Pacific democracies together account for roughly half of global gross domestic product. Around 85% of global foreign direct investment, portfolio investment, and foreign exchange reserves sit within the Rimland system. And the United States and its partners capture most of the profits in high-technology industries. The problem is that this coalition is powerful but divided in purpose. Members hedge, delay, and sometimes regard American unilateralism as a threat. The article argues that the Rimland should not demand complete self-sufficiency from every country. It should build a redundant network that jointly produces chips, critical minerals, energy, ammunition, platforms, and protection for undersea cables. It should coordinate investment screening, export controls, and responses to economic coercion, while compensating partners that suffer retaliation. The Heartland knows the order it wants, a world divided into spheres of influence and controlled through industrial choke points. The Rimland has richer markets and superior technology, but power that is not organized has no strategic meaning.
Section 2. Nuclear Umbrella and Indo-Pacific Deterrence. This section discusses how commitments translate into usable power, the credibility of nuclear guarantees, the difficulty of transoceanic reinforcements, forward deployments, and the autonomy of allies collectively determine whether a crisis can be averted. 2.1. The broken nuclear umbrella. The article argues that extended nuclear deterrence was created for the Cold War, when a Soviet conquest of Western Europe would have transformed the global balance of power, and the United States could just barely make a credible threat to accept nuclear devastation for its allies. Today, most wars are regional, and Washington increasingly defines alliances by their contribution to core American interests. Leaders in Latvia, Poland, and South Korea cannot be certain that the United States would expose its cities to nuclear destruction for their defense. South Korea is therefore debating three paths: the return of United States tactical nuclear weapons, a nuclear sharing arrangement, or withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the construction of an independent arsenal. Seoul already possesses ballistic missile submarines, modern combat aircraft, hardened airfields, and mobile missiles. It mainly lacks warheads, fissile material production, and a nuclear command system. The article argues that Washington should accept nuclear sharing if Seoul chooses it, and should help manage sanctions, miscalculation, and preventative attack if South Korea decides to build an independent deterrent. Europe faces a different problem. Poland and other Eastern members lack secure delivery systems and the material base for independent arsenals. A better solution is to reform North Atlantic Treaty Organization nuclear sharing by replacing the present one-key system with 3 keys held by France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, supported by hardened storage, air defense, dispersed runways, and secure communications at forward bases. A new system should reduce single points of failure, increase Allied control, and create usable capability. Reassuring allies with Cold War promises that no longer command confidence will only force Washington and its partners into a more dangerous choice later. 2.2. The Mirage of China's military edge. The article argues that China can inflict enormous damage on Taiwan, but cannot conquer and hold the island, and it is unlikely to gain that capability soon. Beijing's military buildup over the past 30 years has served global power projection, maritime frontier defense, nuclear status, and long-range denial. It has not concentrated all resources on the amphibious lift required for an invasion. China has a large fleet, aircraft carriers, medium and long-range missiles, submarines, air defense, and surveillance systems. But its central weakness remains the ability to move vehicles, troops, and follow-on supplies across the Taiwan Strait in sufficient numbers. Air and missile strikes, blockade, seizure of outlying islands, or attacks on the leadership would not deliver unification. They would invite international sanctions, Taiwanese mobilization, and reinforcement by the United States, Japan, and the Philippines. Taiwan increased its defense budget from about $10 billion in 2015 to about $18 billion in 2025, extended conscription from 4 months to 1 year, and is preparing to use drones, missiles, dispersion, and civil defense to slow an invasion. United States submarines, hypersonic weapons, distributed bases, and long-range reconnaissance can concentrate on Chinese ports, fixed installations, and amphibious formations crossing a narrow strait. For at least the next decade, trends in hypersonic weapons, uncrewed systems, electronic warfare, and cyber warfare favor Taiwan and its partners, provided that investment and training continue. The article rejects apocalyptic alarmism because exaggerating China's advantage can weaken Taiwanese confidence and encourage Beijing to take risks. The required posture is confidence without complacency and an accurate public account of the military balance.
Section 3. Great Power Pressure and Regional Reshaping. This section examines how nations translate economic dependence, industrial capacity, social mobilization, and partnerships into long-term strategies. The availability of resources is not the key factor. The key is their ability to be rapidly mobilized during a crisis. 3.1. The fault lines in China's power. The article begins with the 2025 United States and China trade confrontation. After Washington raised tariffs, Beijing used its control over about 90% of global rare earth processing to impose export restrictions and force the United States to retreat from several measures. The episode exposed a long-standing American strategic deficit. Washington has tried to repair its own vulnerabilities without systematically exploiting China's. China faces weak domestic demand, a property slump, rising local debt, high youth unemployment, an aging population, military corruption, and deep dependence on foreign energy, capital, advanced technology, export markets, and the dollar. The article argues that pressure should focus on vulnerabilities that matter to Chinese leaders, are difficult to solve, and can be influenced from outside while avoiding deliberate harm to ordinary people. Semiconductor controls should be coordinated with Japan, the Netherlands, and other partners, and should cover chips, equipment, maintenance, cloud computing, and indirect transshipment. The United States should also organize economies damaged by Chinese overcapacity and coordinate trade rules, investment screening, and rules of origin. Dollar access, seaborne energy, and commodities can provide reserve leverage in a severe crisis, but they should not be used routinely in ordinary trade disputes. Chinese influence operations, illegal activity, and economic coercion should be exposed through evidence that independent institutions can verify. The purpose of leverage is not to collapse China, it is to change specific, observable behavior. Domestic renewal and external pressure must reinforce one another, and every tool must be tested in advance, coordinated with allies, and embedded in institutions that can survive changes of government. 3.2. Iran's New Grand Strategy. The article argues that Iran appeared battered when the United States and Israel began their war in February 2026. But 3 months later, the regime retained military and industrial capacity. No uprising had emerged, and the war had produced the first major generational transformation of the Islamic Republic. The new military and security leadership grew up after the revolution and places greater emphasis on national defense, organizational discipline, and technocratic statecraft than on revolutionary grandiosity. Tehran decentralized parts of trade, agriculture, and social administration, created operational command networks that could survive the loss of senior leaders, embedded engineers in underground missile facilities so that launchers and entrances could be repaired under fire, and used large numbers of cheap drones to exhaust radars and interceptors and open routes for precision missiles. Iran also combined drones, fast boats, mines, and coastal fire to turn the Strait of Hormuz into an economic lever and a deterrent against another attack, while moving closer to China. The war did not erase public anger over repression, corruption, and economic mismanagement, but nationalism temporarily blurred the divide between state and society. A new social bargain is being framed around defense of the homeland, reconstruction, and administrative competence rather than religious ideology alone. This does not make the regime more benign. It may become more organized and more efficient at repressing dissent. The long-term strength of the new leadership will depend on whether wartime adaptation produces reconstruction, employment, income, and improvements that ordinary Iranians can feel.
3.3. The next Russia threat. The article argues that even if Russia is defeated in Ukraine, it will remain Europe's main military threat for years. Reconstitution is not a question of whether it will happen, but when. A full recovery may take 5 to 7 years, but shortly after the war, Moscow may already be able to threaten Ukraine or members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization through limited incursions and intense missile and drone attacks. At least 400,000 Russian soldiers have been killed, with British intelligence suggesting a figure close to 500,000, and equipment losses have been immense. Yet the active force has expanded from about 850,000 before the war to 1.3 million. Many formations have added drone, reconnaissance, assault, and electronic warfare units, and Russia now produces millions of tactical drones each year. It produced more than 70,000 large one-way attack drones in 2025 and contracted for at least 100,000 more in 2026. Russia has improved dynamic targeting, precision strike, and the mass employment of drones. It is also constrained by officer losses, minimal training, centralized command, corruption, demographic decline, economic stagnation, and a weakened ability to conduct large-scale combined arms maneuver. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization retains advantages in air power, naval power, intelligence, and long-range precision strike, but it lacks Ukraine's experience of a battlefield saturated by drones, constant surveillance, and mass precision. European forces must grow and invest in ammunition, air defense, counter-drone systems, engineering, logistics, and medical support while changing force structure. The most dangerous mistake is to confuse Russian decline with Russian impotence. Limited challenges will arrive before full reconstitution, so preparation must begin now. 3.4. Why China First will fail. The article argues that as the United States retreats from some of the responsibilities of the post-war order under the banner of America First, observers are asking whether Beijing will replace it. China maintains formal partnerships with more than 100 countries and places itself at the center of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS group, and other non-Western platforms. Yet Beijing prefers flexible and ambiguous partnerships and avoids the obligations of collective defense, long-term financing, crisis management, and reconstruction. When Iran came under attack from the United States and Israel, China continued to buy Iranian oil and supplied some dual-use goods, but it did not provide open, large-scale military assistance or secure the Strait of Hormuz. After Russia invaded Ukraine, Beijing maintained trade and diplomatic support, but Moscow still turned to North Korea for troops, artillery shells, and missiles. When the United States seized Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, China largely confined itself to condemnation. Partnership labels can produce votes at the United Nations, diplomatic visibility, and international legitimacy, but they rarely create combined planning, integrated logistics, interoperable weapons, or a willingness to absorb sanctions and casualties. A Taiwan war would reveal this limitation at its sharpest, because China would probably bear the main burden of logistics, economic pressure, and United States intervention alone. To turn a partnership network into leadership, Beijing would have to restrain friends, mediate wars, protect sea lanes, and finance reconstruction. China has chosen influence without responsibility. That model can expand its presence, but it cannot replace the alliances, rules, and public goods built over decades by the United States. 3.5. The Afghanistan Reckoning. The article reviews the end of the 20-year United States war in Afghanistan. Washington spent about $1 trillion. More than 120,000 Afghan civilians were killed or injured. More than 775,000 United States service members were deployed, and more than 2,400 died. 5 years after the withdrawal, no terrorist attack against the United States has been carried out by a group based in Afghanistan, which means that the terrorist threat that drove repeated decisions to stay was exaggerated. Taliban rule has produced Afghanistan's longest period of peace since 1979, and poppy cultivation fell by about 95% in 2023. At the same time, the economy has stagnated. Poverty and healthcare have worsened. Girls have been barred from secondary school and university, and women face severe restrictions on work and movement. The risks from al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have not disappeared. Ayman al-Zawahiri was killed in a house linked to the Haqqani network, and al-Qaeda members still appear to be rebuilding a presence. But those risks have not justified the long deployment of tens of thousands of troops. The United States stayed because of the fear created by September 11th. Domestic political anxiety about collapse after withdrawal, intelligence processes that compressed alternative forecasts into consensus, poor knowledge of the Taliban, and an emotional aversion to admitting that sacrifice might have been in vain. 5 years later, the greatest danger is not simply the return of a safe haven. It is collective forgetting, the failure to remember how immediate fear led the country to accept immense and enduring costs.
Section 4. Identity, Democracy, and Africa Policy. This section delves into the realm of institutions and narratives, how national identity shapes domestic and foreign policy, how democracy restores representativeness, and why the United States is repeatedly swayed by localized transactions in Africa. 3 articles discuss governance capacity from different perspectives. 4.1. Who is China? The article argues that many observers focus on Chinese manufacturing, artificial intelligence, military power, Taiwan, and leadership succession, while overlooking the unresolved identity crisis of the People's Republic of China. China possesses an ancient civilization and an unmistakable culture, yet the modern state compresses civilization, empire, territory, and Communist Party rule into a single continuous entity and repeatedly declares its borders sacred and unchanging. For much of history, central dynasties did not exercise stable control over what are now Northeast China, Mongolia, Tibet, and Xinjiang. The Qing dynasty incorporated these areas into a larger empire, and the Republic of China and the People's Republic inherited most of those borders. Early Chinese communists once supported self-determination for minority regions and even for provinces, but after taking power, they abandoned those positions and relied on symbolic autonomy, security control, and rewritten history to preserve unity. Formal constitutions have not durably restrained supreme power, so political conflict has repeatedly been converted into a struggle between enemies and handled through military and security force. The state celebrates cultural diversity while denying different groups the right to explain their own political experience, and tightening intellectual control drives scholars into internal exile, self-censorship, or departure. Material success can postpone hard choices, but it cannot answer who holds rights, where state power ends, and how frontier regions participate in government. Asking who China is does not deny the existence of China. It separates civilization, people, territory, and ruling system. Only open discussion of those distinctions can turn a diverse history into a source of order and resilience.
4.2. A democracy safe for the world. The article reviews the argument that representative democracy should be replaced by citizens' assemblies chosen by lot. Supporters contend that elections select people who most desire power, possess resources, and excel at public competition, while excluding ordinary citizens who are less ambitious, more willing to compromise, and perhaps better suited to responsible judgment. Citizens' assemblies in Iceland, Ireland, and France show that random selection can increase social diversity and allow participants to study evidence and deliberate about constitutional reform, abortion, climate policy, and other difficult issues. Yet assembly recommendations still require implementation by governments, legislatures, or referendums, and the vast majority who are not selected may become less rather than more attentive to politics. Abolishing elections, parties, and campaigns would not abolish power. It would transfer power to organizers, experts, staff members, media, and agenda setters. Electoral competition forces politicians to seek public support. Parties organize interests and communicate programs, and opposition allows citizens to remove failed leaders. These functions cannot be replaced entirely by temporary random selection. The article therefore supports citizens' assemblies as a supplement that can break deadlock, set agendas, and provide informed public judgment. It also calls for reform of primary elections, districting, campaign finance, ranked choice voting, and proportional representation, together with renewed civic education and civic associations. Democracy requires both competition and deliberation, periodic authorization, visible accountability, information, and social cooperation. No single institutional device is a cure for democratic decline. 4.3. Why America Gets Africa Wrong. The article argues that the Trump administration describes its Africa policy as a break from aid, democracy promotion, and human rights in favor of mutually beneficial transactions, but the change is mainly one of degree. For decades, the United States has combined public health and democratic programs with bargains involving authoritarian leaders, counterterrorism, military access, minerals, and diplomatic support. African leaders are not passive objects of great power competition. They understand the divided channels of Washington and use geography, resources, security cooperation, and personal relationships to obtain aid, debt relief, sanctions against rivals, and protection for domestic political survival. Black American moderates, Pan-African organizations, government officials, lobbyists, and more recently, country-specific African immigrant groups have also shaped policy through a shadow politics that operates alongside formal institutions. These networks sometimes advance the struggle against apartheid and a wider sense of public responsibility, but they also protected authoritarian rulers. The Minerals and Security Agreement between the United States and the Democratic Republic of the Congo shows how a president may quickly gain sanctions against competitors, military support, and international legitimacy, while employment, tax revenue, infrastructure, and community compensation for ordinary citizens may take years to appear. When Washington treats the interests of a government as the interest of a country and its people, it may secure a short-term transaction and lose long-term credibility. A more stable policy requires continent-wide principles, transparent review of informal influence, continuous tracking of implementation, and direct engagement with unions, local government, women, youth organizations, and the media so that presidential offices and lobbying firms do not monopolize the relationship.
All right, we are now ready to enter today's main program. Before we do, please like, save, and share this episode so that other people who need it can also see today's content and become better versions of themselves. Thank you. You can now use the timeline in the video description or the pinned comment to find the articles that interest you and listen to them in depth.